everyone, and welcome to Pagan Happy Hour and Happy Earth Day, everyone. I hope you all have had a great week so far. So, today we are going to be discussing the European witch trials. We'll be looking at how Christians viewed witches during the Middle Ages. We'll be discussing the role of the printing press, oddly enough, in the dissemination and spread of witch hysteria in Europe. We'll be discussing the famous witch finder general known as Matthew Hopkins. We will, of course, be discussing some more gruesome aspects of this, as in the torture and death aspect of the European witch trials. And then finally, we will be looking at the legacy of the witch trials as a whole and how we modern witches might kind of deal with all of this historical baggage in a way. So, a lot to cover today. I was so happy to see you all choose this topic in yesterday's poll. If you are unfamiliar with Pagan Happy Hour, welcome. I go live every Friday at 5 p.m. Central, 6 p.m. Eastern. And it's just a great way for us fellow pagans and witches to chat, to share resources, to have discussions about a wide variety of pagan and witchy topics. And if you do enjoy the show, there are two ways you can support it. The first is through my Patreon, which I have linked down below in the description box. And if you do choose to become a patron, you also gain access to my exclusive Discord community, which is a really fun place to chat and share resources with fellow witches and pagans. And the other great way you can support the show today is through the super chat feature, which is the $ button at the bottom of the chat box. And through that, you can donate any amount and your comment or question will pop up, and I'll be sure to bring in your thoughts and ideas into the conversation. And as we will be going along, I will be looking over here at your ideas, at your thoughts, at your comments, and I'm going to try and bring in as much of what you have to say as well. So now let's jump right into it. I would love for you all in the comments to tell me where you happen to be watching from this evening and what you are drinking tonight. So let me cue that drink music and we will get started. So I'm having a nice red wine here. Okay, let's see where you all are chiming in from. We have people watching from DC, from Texas, Kansas City, Illinois, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, Minnesota, Indiana, Vancouver, Czech Republic, Germany, let's see, Vermont, Wyoming, we have Glasgow, we have New Jersey, Massachusetts, Dallas, Fort Worth, Serbia, California, Belgium, Reno, Boise, Maryland, Ohio, Atlanta, Seattle, England, Denver, Holland, and Italy. Well, thank you all so much for joining, and I'm happy to see so many Europeans watching today, as we will, of course, be discussing the European witch trials, which is such a huge topic. So, of course, today will just be an introduction. Now, I specifically chose to focus on Europe and not just witch trials in general, because the American witch trials, I'm sure you're familiar with Salem, of course, kind of had their own thing going on. So I thought that might be a topic for a future Pagan Happy Hour. So today we'll just be looking at Europe. And next, let's jump into it. I'm going to turn off the drink music and we will get started. Okay. So the first thing I wanted to discuss is the Christian view of the witch at this time. So we're mostly looking at the Middle Ages here. And of course, Europe is huge, right? So I'm going to be generalizing a lot here. But I thought it would be good to start by discussing how Christians viewed the witch as a person, as an archetype, as an idea. And this is much different than in pagan societies. There have been magical practitioners throughout pretty much every pagan culture. We've discussed many of these types of people in previous pagan happy hours. For example, if you check out my pagan happy hour on Nordic witchcraft, we talked about the Vova. Of course, you have the oracles, like the Oracle of Delphi in an ancient Greek context. So, throughout pagan societies, there have always been individuals, often women, but not always, that took on these magical arts. But in those societies, they weren't viewed as wicked or evil. They might be considered outsiders, but they definitely did not have that evil connotation. That starts coming into effect after the conversion times in Europe, after the majority of countries had fully converted to Christianity. So I think you also have to think about this time period in general, where Europe during the Middle Ages was going through a lot of turmoil, right? You have plagues, you have crop failures, you have famine, you have quite a lot of war going on as well. So a lot was happening, and this caused a lot of Christian theologians to start to analyze and ask questions about the concept of evil. What was the root of evil? Why was all of this horrible, traumatic stuff happening in Europe? What was the cause of these plagues? So they started to look at other ideas. What could be the root cause of everything that happened to be going wrong? And I think you can see where this is leading, because eventually they started to look at the theory that perhaps a lot of this drama could in part be caused by malevolent magic, black magic, dark magic, evil magic, and that this magic was being performed by people, by witches who had made a covenant with the devil. Of course, in Christianity, there's this whole worldview that Satan or the devil is always looking for ways to weasel into society, to corrupt the world and the minds of men. So this is when this idea really started to take hold. And as scholars, Christian scholars such as, let's see, St. Augustine and Thomas of Aquinas, they started to kind of go with this theory that perhaps witches might in fact be the root cause of everything that was going wrong at that time. Now, this is also an interesting time because you still have a lot of pagan traditions still being practiced, right? As we know, when Christianity came in and converted the Europeans, not these pagan practices didn't all go away all of a sudden. In fact, Christianity in a lot of instances was totally okay with kind of incorporating some of this stuff as a way to make the conversion a bit more palatable to the locals, which is why you see so many pagan references in many of the modern Christian holidays. Of course, we've talked about that in so many videos on my channel, such as recently we had Ostara, which is where we get all of these symbolism, the bunnies and the eggs of Easter. Or, of course, you have Yule and Christmas. So much crossover between paganism and Christianity. But in Christianity, there is this kind of very specific binary between good and evil. So when these Christian theologians were looking at their time period and the traditions that the people were participating in, there was kind of a desire to make sure we separated the good from the evil and to maybe even attempt to remove some of those pagan traditions and practices that had seeped their way into Christianity. So you also have that going on at the same time. Now, when we look at who was actually accused of witchcraft, they weren't necessarily pagans. They weren't probably people who would necessarily call themselves pagan by any means. In some instances, they might have been associated with things like herbalism or healing using herbal methods, which is some of this kind of ancient knowledge that was passed down from pre Christian societies. But overall, it's not like they were actually successful at stamping out these pagan traditions or killing people who were still celebrating some of these ancient traditions. Though I think they did try to a certain extent. Now, it was definitely believed that if they were to find these witches who were under the influence of Satan and stop them, then maybe that might restore balance in the world and be the solution they were looking for to fully preventing and stopping a lot of these really negative plagues and wars and famines that were going on. So I thought we'd start there and kind of laying out what is the Christian view of the witch, and how the Christian witch is completely different from a pagan concept of a magical practitioner operating within their society. It's quite a big difference here. So next, we're going to be talking about the printing press and why that had such a huge role to play here. But before we do, let me check your comments and see what you have to say about this topic so far. Okay. Tama in the comments has a great point, saying, one of my thoughts about the Christian persecution of witches was tied back to the idea that all women were evil because of Eve's sins. Yes, we will be getting into that because there is clearly a gendered aspect to the witch trials. They are inherently kind of anti woman in a lot of ways. So we will be getting into that. Let's see. Any other comments here? Crow Goblin in the comments is mentioning the witch finders and how they were paid for finding witches so that they saw witches everywhere. Yes, we will be talking about the witch finders soon. Let's see. Okay. Awesome. Oh, and then Grace has an interesting comment, that some of the early people persecuted were kind of heretic Christian groups, such as the Cathars. Yes, that's true. These weren't just, women who dabbled in pagan-esque activities that were accused. The church actually used the witch trials as a whole to kind of get rid of people who were in these kind of more heretic fringe aspects of Christianity too. So that's a great point. I see Cosmic Coven has a recommendation for us. She's recommending Witch Trials, A Century of Murder as an excellent documentary to learn more about these European witch trials. Great suggestion. Thank you. Let's see. Okay. Christina in the comments is saying that I think a lot of the accused witches were on the margins of society. That is true. Overall, the people that were accused were poor women, and this is where the idea of the witch at the edge of town comes from. These were often women who were kind of already considered outsiders. Maybe they were widows, maybe they were spinsters. In some way, they did not fit the prescribed role of woman in society. So they were singled out for that reason and often accused. We do have a couple super chats, one from Rachel, thank you very much, and one from Daka with a comment here that says, a lot of persecutions of witches have to do with medicine since women usually filled the role of healers, which went against the priest's authority. This is a great point. Yes, a lot of women that were accused were midwives, for example, or just people that worked with herbs. So all of this herbal knowledge that was so important, that had been passed down for generations, once Christianity took over, it had kind of its own view on medicine that was a bit different than the pagan idea of medicine. You even have things like the four humors and leeches and blood, and like all this kind of crazy stuff they were doing, which went against a lot of the traditional herbal knowledge that women tended to perform and pass down. So women were definitely singled out. And even things that were associated with women, these realms were often the places where the accusations or the biggest risk would occur. Childbirth being one of the main ones. If your midwife was present and your child died in labor, which is very common at that time period, you might be accused of witchcraft. So you'd have to be careful there. Um, so a lot of these realms that were traditionally associated with women were actually the areas where you had the most risk. There was a lot of fear around the feminine, the female body, female power, female knowledge. So you see that not just in witch trials, but when you actually, look at Christian history, a lot of it is kind of based around how do we diminish the role of the sacred feminine? How do we diminish the role of the female in society? So you guys bring up great points here. Next, I wanted to talk a bit about the printing press because I find this interesting. So, the invention of the printing press actually created a much bigger hysteria about witchcraft because the information could disseminate so much easier and it could travel throughout the entirety of Europe. And the printing press was kind of new. This was a new phenomenon. In a way, it's almost reflective of modern times. When we think about the internet, it's this brand new technology that allows the dissemination of information. And because of that, it causes a bunch of upheavals and changes in society. So the printing press kind of did the same thing here. For the first time, information was widely accessible and could be shared across all of Europe. And the witch trials and the pamphlets about witches and identifying witches were also being shared, which created this huge kind of contagious hysteria. Now, you've probably already heard of the most famous book or pamphlet from this time period. So in the 15th century, Heinrich Kramer, he published The Witch's Hammer. Have you heard about this before? Let me know in the comments. It was called the Malleus Maleficarum, which means the witch's hammer. Now, this really set the standard for identifying and persecuting witches. He had a lot of opinions when it came to what witches were about, what they were doing. One quote in particular I wanted to share. In The Witch's Hammer, it stated that all witchcraft comes from carnal lust, which is insatiable in all women. So here you can already see this kind of anti-woman bias going on. It almost seems like he's projecting a little bit here. So there was this kind of great fear of female sexuality, female lust, and the idea is that the church tied female sexuality and lust towards evil. This is an evil thing. Women are just have all this natural evilness inside of them because of Eve. And they're so susceptible to the devil's influence, and they're, so susceptible to becoming witches. I see Peach in the comments asking, why do cultures always fear women? I know. And it is kind of sad. And one of the reasons I am pagan is I do feel like, of course, pagans weren't perfect when it came to gender, but they were a little bit better, in my view, than the Abrahamic religions. So, yeah, it gets pretty wild. Now, we do know that gender played a huge role here. Usually, I think it's between 70 and 80% of those accused were women. So they were definitely the ones that were looked at, the ones that had to fear, the ones that were being hunted. And also, there's kind of a lot of creepy factors here too, because a lot of the witch identifying methods, like finding the witch's mark, which we'll talk a little bit about later, involved women undressing in front of a group of men. So a lot of this stuff, in a way, was also kind of to just get women naked. It almost has like an incel vibe to it, like, oh, you refuse me, then I'm going to accuse you of witchcraft, and then you're at huge risk and you're going to be naked anyway. It's very disturbing, as we all know, and so yeah, I thought I would bring that up. Now, the witch's hammer, it was also unique in the fact that it contained a series of images. These images were woodblock prints. Now, this is important because keep in mind, not everyone could read at this time. So these images could allow the common folk, the folk that were illiterate, to know what to look for when it came to trying to find witches and what they were doing. So these woodblock prints and the images in them are actually the root of a lot of the symbolism of the witch that we know and love today. For example, the idea of the witch riding the broomstick. This comes from the woodblock print in the witch's hammer, or a witch turning into an animal or casting a spell with a wand. All of these were immortalized in these prints that were then disseminated through the printing press all throughout Europe. And even today, now we take these images, we take this symbolism, and in a way, the modern witch kind of subverts it. We take power in the image of the broom and the wand and black cats and all of these things that were once symbols of horror and the fact that you would be persecuted, and we are kind of reclaiming them in some way. But if you're wondering where a lot of that imagery that we associate with the witch comes from, it in parts comes from this time period, comes from these pamphlets, and specifically from the witch's hammer. So I think that's really neat, just kind of the idea that this imagery that we associate with the witch was in a way invented in order to find and persecute the witches. Sen in the comments does have a good point here. He says, apparently pagans used to jump up and down on their brooms in the fields to promote a good harvest, and that somehow turned into witches riding brooms into the night sky to wreak havoc. That's true too. Some of this might have also come from earlier pagan customs. The broom thing is definitely true, I believe, in my personal opinion. So yeah, great point. Let's see. Okay, just checking your comments here. Catherine has an interesting comment. She says the image of witches with big and green noses likely comes from women having been beaten before they were brought before the public to be executed. I don't know about that, but that sounds very disturbing. Thank you for sharing. Let's see. Okay. Warren has a good point, saying some of the charms in the Malleus Maleficarum actually witches use today in an ironic kind of way. I thought that's interesting, and I wanted to bring this up too. So there are obviously subsets of modern witchcraft traditions. Traditional witchcraft is one of the subsets, and traditional witchcraft in particular actually uses information from this time period. So uses texts that have details of trial records, details of confessions by supposed witches, and uses that information in their modern practice. So that's kind of neat. If you're interested in the witch trials as a whole and how you can kind of subvert, which was once kind of a horrible thing, into a modern reclaiming witchcraft practice, you might want to look into traditional witchcraft because they sometimes use witch trial records to determine their rituals and spells. So, yeah, good point. So I wanted to briefly talk too about Matthew Hopkins, who was a very famous British person in all of this. Of course, now I'm just speaking about Britain. The witch trials happened kind of all throughout Europe, but in different times and different ways. So again, I'm generalizing here, but I wanted to talk a bit about Matthew Hopkins. He was known as the witch finder general, and he and his associates were really responsible for the increase in the witch trials in the 1600s and this general witch hysteria. I do believe he was responsible for over 100 witch executions, so a pretty important figure in all of this. One of the interesting things, too, is to look at how they were prosecuting this from a legal perspective. And it was kind of convoluted. So the work of Hopkins, when he found a witch, when he found a woman that he wanted to accuse, his goal was not necessarily to prove that that woman had committed acts of baneful magic. Instead, his goal was to prove that she had made a covenant with the devil. So that was more important to prove than the fact that she just did bad spells. And this was important because before this point in history, any malicious acts on the parts of witches were treated identically to other criminals or other criminal acts. So there was a lot of limitations on things like torture. But if the devil's involved, then it kind of is an exception to the rule, and you can get away with a lot more. So the goal of Matthew Hopkins and these other witch finders was to prove that the witch, out of her own free will, entered into a relationship with Satan. And it was this relationship, this choice of working with the devil, that actually gave her these magical powers. So, this is where the whole kind of concept of signing away your soul to the devil comes from. So, for Christians, it was really important that they proved this connection to the devil. And that this was something the woman chose. She chose to give her soul to the devil out of her own free will. And once that could be proved, then you could basically do whatever you wanted with her. And you wouldn't be limited to prosecuting and determining judgment like you would for other crimes. So I think this is kind of interesting, just kind of this convoluted, weird way that they went about kind of trying to kill and torture as many women as they possibly could. So yeah, it's getting pretty intense. Um, so let me see, let me check your comments here. Okay. Awesome. Just checking your thoughts. Oh, Alva has an interesting comment that says, evidently, the prosecutions for witchcraft date back to the late Roman Empire. So this is after the Roman Empire was Christian. and that some countries tried to overturn these laws in the early medieval period, but brought them back later. I did not know that about the idea that witch trials were happening in the late Roman Empire. So that sounds really interesting. I'll have to look into that more. Let's see. Okay. Jessica has a point. She says, shouldn't healing people have been good? So why were these people prosecuted? You would think, but you can only heal people through God. That's the idea. You aren't allowed to heal people through herbs and plants, through the earth's power. You have to heal them through God. So that was the issue. Okay, so now this is where you're going to have to take a couple drinks because we're getting into the dark stuff at this point. We're at the halfway point of Pagan Happy Hour, so take a sip because we're going to be talking about the torture and death aspect of the witch trials. So get ready for it. So there were a variety of ways that these witch finders implemented to find a witch or to prove someone was a witch. Now, it was a common belief that a witch could be discovered through the process of pricking their skin with pins and needles. Now, this practice, it derived from the belief that all witches and sorcerers had something called a witch's mark, and they would not feel pain or bleed from that spot. So basically, if they poked you with a needle and you didn't bleed, you're a witch. Now, what the witch's mark was is usually they would be looking for like blemishes, moles, even freckles, any birthmarks, which we all have some of that. So clearly they're going to find something. And of course, this was an excuse to get a girl naked too, right? But one interesting thing I learned as I was researching this topic that is really crazy is they've found these tools, these witchfinder specific types of pins that they would use. And some of them had hollow handles and retractable points. Think like a click pencil, for example. So this would give the appearance of the needle going into the skin all the way to the hilt, but in reality, it wasn't. So when they removed it, oh, no blood. She must be a witch. But if you think of like a click pencil, you know, you hold it down, it looks like you're stabbing in, but you're not. Same kind of method here. So they had this tool that they could use in order to falsely accuse a witch. So they could poke her with the normal pin a bunch of places and see blood, and then they pull out, you know, this specialty tool and oh, no blood, she must be a witch. So and almost this like extra level of disturbing here that this they kind of invented this whole tool so that they could falsely accuse women of being a witch. So I thought that was wild. And you know, they weren't just using these tools to find the witch's mark. A lot of these confessions of witchcraft were given through other forms of torture. The torture aspect definitely started to increase after 1468 when the Pope declared witchcraft to be kind of a exceptional crime or something that existed outside of the normal rules of criminal law. And by doing that, he kind of removed all legal limits to the application of torture in cases where evidence was difficult to find, which, of course, in most of these witch trials, there wasn't really any evidence. So they were allowed to use torture since the Pope made this decree. So the whole kind of poking to find the witch's mark was one thing. There were other methods. In Italy, the accused witch was deprived of sleep for periods of up to 40 hours in order to get a confession. They did the same thing in England, but there was no limit on time on how long they would be kept awake. A lot of sexual humiliation was used. Um, Also, they would force women to sit on like steel chairs that had been thrown in the fire, so like hot to burn their skin. So really gross stuff here to elicit these confessions. And of course, so many people confess. When you're under torture, you're going to confess, obviously. And this use of torture has been identified as kind of a key factor in kind of this wider social panic. Because when they were confessing, they were just confessing everything. So they would just shout out names. It could be even your own family member. You're just going to say everything. They're going to ask you who else is a witch, and you're just going to shout any name that comes to mind. So any woman that was being tortured for a confession would end up kind of accusing all these other women just because they were being tortured, and they would say anything to make it stop. So that in part is what led to tons and tons and tons of more people being accused, is through these horrible acts of torture that led to all these confessions. Usually, if you did not confess, then you were let go. So you can imagine how much pressure these women were under to try and not confess. But ultimately, of course, if you're being tortured, you're probably going to confess. Let me see what else you guys have to say here. Let's see. Leah's mentioning they also used a finger press. Yes, they used a lot of really gross stuff to induce these confections. Let's see. Okay, just checking your thoughts here. Okay, so kind of overall, there's been a lot of debate here on what was the extent of the executions in Europe. In general, I think it was around 50,000 in this early modern era, though people say between like 40 and like 70. At one point, someone was throwing out numbers like 1,000,000. That was wrong. I was kind of just, made up. So we're looking at around 50,000 people were executed. Most of them were women. The primary forms of execution were hanging, burning, and beheading. Very dramatic. In the Americas, it's a little bit different. They didn't really burn people. They just hung them or crushed them with stones. So a little bit different on the American side. But that's basically how it all ended up until we kind of get to the Enlightenment and people start finally waking up to how barbaric all of this stuff is. So next, I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about how we deal with this legacy. As modern magical practitioners or modern witches, how do we understand this legacy? How do we incorporate it or not incorporate it or reclaim it? What is our role here when it comes to this very depressing and traumatic history? Um, let's see. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that as well, because I think, in a way, the archetype of the witch has endured so well, in part because of their persecution. The kind of witch hunts and this legacy of depravity, uh, in a way, it kind of determines how we view the witch today. The witch as being the outsider, the witch as being persecuted. even the terminology we use nowadays, like a witch hunt, you see that just people saying that on the news all the time, that term in particular. So clearly, the witch trials have had a huge kind of influence on the psyche of the public, even in the modern zeitgeist. So, what is our role here when we look at the witch trials? Now, you see a lot of stuff on social media where people are like posting posters like, "We are the granddaughters of the witches you didn't burn," and stuff like that. That's kind of like a more surface level aspect of this. Um, Overall, I think that this was a really, long time ago. I don't feel the need to be a victim here or to hate, Christians for what they did. I do think it's important to learn this history and to understand it, uh, and to kind of see how it fits into the bigger picture of what religions have done over time, especially when it comes to devaluing and demeaning the female, the feminine, the women in society. So I do think we can kind of look at it from that perspective, for sure. But I'm curious on what you guys have to say here. I want to hear your thoughts and your opinions on this legacy of the witch trials and how you really understand it and how you kind of incorporate, not necessarily incorporate it, but how you kind of see how it's affected our own modern day practices. Let me see what you guys have to say. Let's see. Catherine has a good recommendation to read Witches, Midwives, and Nurses, as it talks about the witch trials and points to some ways to reclaim the power and the role of women. It's a good recommendation. I'll have to check that out. Let's see. Kylo is asking, I wonder why the stigma of the witch has been kept alive. Well, we are, of course, still living, at least in America, in a Christian dominant society. So even though we now know that burning witches at the stake isn't a good idea, the core tenet of Satan trying to work his way through, trying to gain influence, and this general dichotomy between good and evil is still an active part of the faith. So naturally, that's kind of why witches are still feared, I think. Let's see. Uh, Meredith is mentioning it's also how Christians see themselves as being persecuted and as outsiders. Yeah, that's really weird, especially in America where they are by far the majority. So they're not really being persecuted or outsiders, even though they like to pretend or play the victim, I guess. Let's see. I see this is all probably due to religion still ruling the world. Perhaps that's so. Um, Sen is asking, shouldn't there be an apology? That'd be nice, but I think it's so much time has passed and it's so nebulous. Like maybe like who would give the apology? At this point, right? Maybe the Pope, I guess, but yeah, I'm not going to wait for an apology, I guess. Let's see. Witchcraft Creed in the comments says, let's continue to protect one another. Yes, I think one of the things this might teach us is the importance of community as a whole in this witch and pagan space, that we kind of have to stick together. While I, of course, don't think anything like this is going to be happening again anytime soon, it's important that we are kind of a coalition, a team here, that makes sure that we're keeping an eye on this stuff. Let's see. I see some Mighty Sarlacc says that the witch trials have damaged our practices. I'm curious on what you mean by that. I want to hear more. Graves is mentioning that they fear, as in probably like the Christians, they fear we might undermine their power base. Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, that is one of the main reasons people were fearing witches and witchcraft, is because it represented a power that existed outside of the Christian worldview. So yeah, definitely. Daka has a super chat. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your support. And saying that people fear what they don't understand. The best cure of this is open mind and knowledge. That's a great point. And I hope I'm doing, in a way, my small part here on YouTube with this by just providing a place for discussion, a place to grow and learn, that hopefully more people will learn about the witch trials, will learn about witchcraft as a whole, will learn about paganism, and that fear of the unknown will start to go away. Let's see. Peach has a good comment that says, we can learn from the witch hunts and how being accused is not the same as being found guilty with real evidence. That's a good point. Perhaps the witch trials did have some influence when you think about the court system in general, especially here in America, where you are innocent until proven guilty. Whereas back in the witch trials, it kind of seemed like you were guilty until proven innocent. Let's see. Okay. Catherine's mentioning that we are independent thinkers who value self-sovereignty and freedom, and as such, we are a threat. Yes, I think so. I do think we witches, one of the things that does define us is our free thinking ability. We do not want to be we don't want to be put in a box. We're going to believe what we want to believe. We're going to do what we want to do. We don't like to be told what to do. We kind of rebel against that. So yeah, I think that's true. Let's see. Joey's asking, in the United States, we have the First Amendment, which technically prohibits an official state religion. So I get confused when people say America is a Christian nation. That is true that obviously we're not officially a Christian nation, but culturally, there are a lot of Christian aspects that are kind of interwoven in our current governmental systems. Yeah. Leah has a good point, saying the witch trials were to scare women. Women who were overly powerful were being publicly tortured to make us fear being powerful. Look at Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc is a great point to bring up here. Again, a powerful woman who she was claiming she was speaking to God, but people ultimately accused her of basically witchcraft and executed her. So yeah, I totally see what you mean there. Let's see. Witchcraft Creed in the comments says America feels like a theocracy. Sometimes I feel that too. Sometimes. Lori is mentioning the Pledge of Allegiance that we all say in school. Yeah, you have the phrase "under God" in there. It definitely has this Christian bend to it. But yeah, you guys are bringing up some great ideas and points here. So I am about out of my wine here. Let me know if you have anything else you want to share about this topic, or really anything in our last few minutes here related to witchcraft and paganism. I am here to answer your questions. If you did value this episode, I would love for you to donate any amount. You, of course, don't need to, but if it is within your budget, it really does help me keep this show alive. I see your comments now. Someone's telling me to just get more wine. That might be too much, but thank you for sharing. Let's see. what comments and questions you guys have to say for the end of the show today. And I do want to thank you for sticking with me through this heavy topic. Normally, I keep Pagan Happy Hour a bit more upbeat and fun, but you guys picked the witch trials. This is obviously going to be a bit of a downer episode. But of course, next week, we will be celebrating Beltane for Pagan Happy Hour. So I do hope you'll be joining me next week for that. We have a super chat from Carrie. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your support. Oh, and Jenna's asking also about Walpurgisnacht. Yes, so we will be talking about both Walpurgisnacht and Beltane next week. Stay tuned for early next week. I'll probably be sharing a Beltane altar video with you. And then on Friday, we will be discussing everything Beltane. If you do want to get a head start, I have probably like 5 videos already all about Beltane. So you can search on my channel if you would like to learn more about Beltane. I think last year I shared a recipe for bannock cakes if you're into that. And I've of course shared a lot of Beltane traditions and things like that on my channel. So stay tuned for that. And I want to thank you guys so much for joining me this evening. Even though, like I said, this topic was a bit intense, not our usual cup of tea for Pagan Happy Hour, I was really glad to share this information and this knowledge with you because I think it's important for us all to discuss and learn about. And I want to thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you next week. Talk to you later. Bye.